Good evening and welcome to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates, live on Channel News Asia. I'm your moderator, Gaurav Kirti. Tonight we're discussing a topic that's getting people quite emotional. For a long time, the only serious measure of a country's development was GDP. In recent years, that's been shifting, and Nobel Prize-winning economists have written a report highlighting the flaws of using GDP as a national target. And in April this year, the first World Happiness Report was released at the United Nations. But critics of such happiness economics say that the data is too subjective and unreliable to be used in policy making. So the debate question is, should happiness be the national target? We polled the studio audience and visitors to our website before the debate. Let's take a look at which way they are leaning right now. Well, it looks like 71.3% agree that yes, happiness should be the national target. The votes are tilted in favor of the affirmative right now. But as we've seen in previous debates, anything can and will happen. So keep your votes coming in. The negative needs to make up for some ground. Well, now for the final time this season, let's meet our panel of adjudicators who will be giving us their comments throughout the program. First up, Mr. Chelva Raja, Senior Counsel at Tan Raja & Shah and Singapore's non-resident High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea. Next is Ms. Eleanor Wong, a playwright and Associate Professor in the Law Faculty at the National University of Singapore. And Mr. Adrian Tan, Director of Dispute Resolution at Singapore law firm Drew Napier. Perhaps before we start this debate, we'll have a quick poll among the judges. How happy are you guys feeling so far?
Very happy.
Well, your jacket's definitely giving away how happy you are. But let's meet the debaters. Now, the first speaker arguing the affirmative case that happiness should be the national target is Mr. Sudhir Vadaketh. He's a senior editor with the Economist Intelligent Unit. Supporting him is Ms. Vadivu Govind, who is the founder of JoyWorks, a consultancy firm that helps businesses improve workplace happiness. Making the case that happiness should not be the national target is Professor Sumit Agarwal. He's an associate professor of finance at the National University of Singapore Business School. His teammate is Professor Leong Kai Wen, an assistant professor of economics at Nanyang Technological University. Welcome to all of you. The first speakers will have 3 minutes each to open their case. They'll then have 1 minute of rebuttal time to rebut each other's arguments and find the holes in each other's cases. Let's get straight into it. Mr. Vadaketh, as an economist, you seem to argue that it's possible to make policy recommendations on objective data, but isn't it going to be much harder to make those policy recommendations on subjective happiness surveys? You have 3 minutes.
Dear judges, moderator, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to discuss happiness, but I must begin with sadness. For more than 50 years, we have been running the wrong race. We have been defining progress narrowly through the lens of economic growth. But why is it that GDP is going up, but many people feel worse off? GDP does not capture inequality, the state of the environment, or the stress on our school children. The truth is that relentless GDP growth does not equate to improve societal well-being. GDP prioritizes production at the expense of nature and people. This is a system that has depleted resources, degraded the environment, and reduced biodiversity. It has led to yawning inequalities in society. Part of the reason we had the global financial crisis is our fixation with economic growth. Part of the reason the people of the Maldives are now looking for a new country is our fixation with economic growth. Part of the reason our grandchildren might never get to meet an orangutan is our fixation with economic growth. That is why we need change, ladies and gentlemen, because there is a way forward to a brighter future. That is by switching our national targets from economic growth to happiness. What is happiness? We define happiness as the overall state of well-being for the individual and society. This can be broken down into 3 things: happiness as a mood, happiness as satisfaction with your life, happiness as living a good and fulfilling life, including your impact on society. Now, all 3 of these things can be measured. And once you measure happiness, you realize that there are other things that matter to humans besides money: health, education, a political voice, social connections and relationships, and the environment. Economic growth is important, but it is not the only thing. By switching our national targets from economic growth to happiness, we will broaden our horizons to look also at things like inequality, poverty levels, and environmental sustainability. This definition of happiness represents the gamut of societal well-being. We must measure what we really value. What we measure affects what we do. If our measurements are flawed, we will make poor decisions. As Aristotle once said, happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Since happiness is our ultimate goal, we should be measuring and maximizing happiness, not anything else. We have been focused for too long on production. We need to broaden our measures of social progress to look at the well-being of all peoples in our society, both current and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vadaketh. Now, he's made that interesting argument that what we measure impacts what we do. And that's actually an argument that Nobel Prize-winning economists like Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi have made in their report, that qualitative measures of well-being are as important to government policy. Bhutan's already made the shift. Yet you guys disagree that it can be used as a national target. Tell us why in your 3 minutes.
Thank you for inviting us, the judges and the moderator and the audience. So, among other things, I think the National Pledge of Singapore says achieving happiness, prosperity, and progress for the nation. So right away, I think happiness is already a target in Singapore. So the right question then to ask is, why should we get rid of our existing measures of success for a country? And what is it that the happiness index would provide above this measure that we have, like a GDP? My simple motto is, if something is not broken, do not fix it. Okay, so first, having said that, let me try to understand who has adopted this happiness. As the moderator pointed out, Bhutan has adopted a happiness index. Now let me compare this to the traditional economic measure. Bhutan's GDP is $2,000 per person, and that of Singapore is $46,000. Now, is that a measure we want? A happiness measure, which may have other things? And one way they try to achieve happiness in the Bhutan measure is by suppressing some minorities at the happiness of others. And the average happiness as a result goes up. So we can think about how you can achieve happiness through these measures. I mean, again, happiness itself is a very nebulous concept. You can have happiness which could be based from genes or the environment. What part of the happiness will you be capturing? Which one do you want to capture, actually? It's very hard. Let me then try to understand happiness. What do we mean that what will make a person happy? I think if I get a BMW, just like my neighbors, would that make my neighbor happy? Most likely not. What I mean by that is it's a relative happiness that we care about, not the absolute. My neighbor is happier because I don't have a BMW, and he does. In other words, this is also called as the Easterly paradox, when he actually looked at the data in the US, and he found that in the cross-section, that if he looked at people who were richer, they were happier against the people who were poorer. But over time, when he looked at this in the US, as the country became richer, that didn't make people necessarily happier. So it's very hard to understand what makes people happy. And it could be inconsistent with its success itself. Let me try to also understand, should governments be then in the business of providing happiness? I want to take 30 seconds to define a government in 3 people. 2 parents and a son as being and the parents are the government and the son is the pupil of that government. The son wants to go to college. The parent wants the son to go actually work, because their happiness is by being driven by the son getting to work and providing money for the family. Now, son's happiness is being driven by if he goes actually to school, but the parent's happiness is if he actually works. Whose happiness should we maximize, the children or the parents? Here, the parents in my example are actually the government.
Thank you so much, Professor Agarwal. Well, in your 1 minute, try and explain to us how we can overcome this problem of subjectivity, where what makes one person happy could make the other person miserable. You have 1 minute.
First, I'd like to address the point about we shouldn't fix what is not broken, because I think GDP alone as a measure of progress is indeed a broken measure. And you can look at the state of the environment, you can look at the state of resources. pollution in this country, inequality. All these things are not captured by GDP, and it is precisely because of this that we need to broaden our view past GDP. So GDP is broken. Happiness as a measure. Now, the measurement of happiness is getting better by the day. 10 years ago, perhaps it might have just been Bhutan who was talking about it, but today you have the UN, the OECD, many different groups are talking about happiness as a measure, and it is improving as a measure. If you go back 30 or 40 years, people said they couldn't measure depression, but today we have a very accurate view of how depression is being measured. And just because something isn't measurable right now does not mean that we should not target it and improve the measure of it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Varakith. He raises an interesting point about depression. Aren't there some people who are biologically predisposed to just being unhappy, and how do governments make that part of their policy? In your 1 minute, please tell us.
So, let me pick up on the point of subjectivity. So what I think about, there are two current existing measures of happiness. One is the Happiness Planet Index, and the other one is the World Happiness Report. So according to the Happiness Planet Index, Costa Rica is the happiest country. But if you look at the World Happiness Report, it ranks Denmark as the most happy country. In the same survey, which is the World Happiness Report, Costa Rica is actually ranked 13th. So it's so subjective that a country can move from number 1 to number 13. Why is it? Because they define happiness very differently. I mean, sometimes you can put environment in it, or sometimes you can remove some of the variable. So it leaves so much fungibility for the governments to define what happiness should be for them. So a government comes in, they don't like the index the way it is, they can redefine it and raise their profile as a country. So I worry about this argument that the governments can manipulate this index.
Thank you so much, Professor Agarwal. Well, we've heard from both speakers in round 1. Let's see which arguments made the judges happier. Shalva?
I think the opposition have a tough job here because who can compete or quarrel with happiness? You know, I mean, it seems a slam dunk. We all want to live happy lives. The best thing we can wish for our children is that they have happy lives. So if that's the case, then surely having happiness as a national target must be right, mustn't it?
Seems logical, but Eleanor, you see some problems with this?
No, actually, I don't. And I think it's for the affirmative to manage to convince us of how sophisticated and to some extent objective current measures of happiness already are, and how much more objective they can become. Because I think that's the one thing that perhaps the negative can argue against it. Having said that, I think that actually the very examples that the negative brought up, such as the Easterly paradox, which suggests that as people get more and more money, they don't necessarily have better lives or feel better about their lives, is in fact a strong argument in favor of our finding other ways or more complex and integrated ways of measuring our well-being, and it seems the happiness people have that. So I'm tonight unusually in black but very happy.
And Adrian?
Well, traditionally, I'm the optimist on the panel. There's always a pessimist on this panel, but I won't tell you who she is. The trouble is, I hate nebulous concepts, and I'm afraid the affirmative really has to satisfy me that there is a way to measure this, because I'm afraid that governments can abuse this and tell us we are happy when we're not.
How can governments abuse it?
Well, they can manipulate the statistics. They can ask us, they can tell us what makes us happy, and we may not agree.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting, for example, about how Bhutan does it, is that all the indicators are quite transparent. We've got, over 100 of them, and many of them are things you can measure objectively. So I think it's for the affirmative to tell us that in greater detail. Would that convince you, Adrian?
That'll make me happy.
Make you happy again?
The debate is still wide open.
It's sad for me to see Adrian sad.
All right, well, it's time for a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear from the second speakers on each team, and we'll have your questions. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debate. We're live in the studio and debating the question, should happiness be the national target? Well, let's take a quick look at the poll before we go on to the second speakers. Looks like the team affirmative have been inching up slowly, and they've got 72.2% of the support right now. So the negative team needs to do some hard work in the next few segments. We've heard from the first speakers before the break. Let's hear from their teammates. Ms. Govind, what do you say to critics who argue that politicians have no business trying to tell people what makes them happier? Philosophers should do the job of telling people how to pursue happiness, not politicians. Tell us why in your 3 minutes why you think happiness should be the target.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to move the discussion beyond measurement because we first need to understand the value of happiness and the role that governments can play. Happiness should be the national target because happiness is beneficial to society. Researchers have found that happier people are healthier and kinder. They have more fulfilling marriages, more peaceful relationships. At work, the happiest employee is 47% more productive than the unhappiest employee. One study even found that happier doctors made the right diagnosis faster. So prioritizing happiness is going to unleash a whole lot of social good and prevent a whole lot of social problems. Secondly, this is very important, happiness can be taught. Researchers say that 40% of our happiness is determined by our choices, our behaviors and attitudes. And governments run schools, so they can use education to equip us with very practical skills in happiness. They can tap on, for example, positive psychology, which is the science of happiness and well-being. Yet how many of us learn these things in schools? We don't. We kind of stumble through life learning things the hard way. Sometimes we suffer, we cause other people suffering, we damage our health. This can be prevented and it should be prevented. Thirdly, happiness can be enabled at work. We spend most of our waking hours at work. It's so important that we're happy at work. Governments are large employers. They can influence the private sector. They can set decent working hours. Family-friendly policies, there's a lot that they can do. Let's look at Denmark, which comes up as the happiest country in many surveys. They have a 37-hour work week. They have excellent family-friendly policies. In schools, their children get to play a lot. They do a lot of project work where they learn cooperation. They're taught the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. If you're going to put economic growth as your final target, the opposite is likely to happen. People are going to be seen more as cogs in the wheel, just producers and consumers of goods and services. So let's look at China as an example. From 1985 to 2002, China's annual growth rate was more than 12%. During the same period, the workplace fatality grew by 46%. Researchers say that this is because they cut costs on safety equipment and safety training. This is what happens when we love things and use people, when we ought to be loving people and using things. So if we place happiness as the national target, we think that we're going to see a major upliftment in many societies.
Thank you so much, Ms. Govind. So it's an interesting argument again that we should prioritize people's happiness above all else. But what do we do as an economist when there's so much subjectivity, when one person's happiness is not the same as another person's happiness? How do we make policy based on that? Professor Leong, perhaps you'd care to share with us in your 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I think, first off, the most straightforward way you can actually try and implement happiness in a country is to say that we should provide goods and services that make majority of the citizens in the country happy. But this raises several concerns because of the difficulty of defining happiness, this opens the door to happy activities that may have negative consequences. I think she has mentioned all the benefits of happiness, but here are some negative consequences. In 1999, the Framework Convention Alliance for Tobacco Control fact sheet shows that over 50% of people in the Asian region smoked. So if we were to pursue happiness as a national target, this would mean that we have to decrease the tax rate. Yes, this would make a lot of people happy, but it would certainly make them less healthy. In a more extreme hypothetical, for example, drugs literally make people happy. If happiness were a national target, why not just spend all our money on happiness-inducing drugs? Next, I think if we try to implement happiness as a national target, we run into another problem, that is the gross unequal distribution of resources. For example, if we want to raise everyone's happiness by 1 unit, because of the variance in taste, this increase in 1 unit could mean allocation of different types of goods to different kinds of people. For example, for a poor person, it may take a cheap meal, but for a rich person, it could take a BMW. So if happiness were a national target, this means that the state would actually have to give rich people BMWs and poor people cheap meals. This leads to unequal distribution of resources as well as growing social stratification between the rich and the poor. If we were also to allow happiness to become a national target, this means that we need government intervention. So consider a man who had originally $1 to spend. Now he only have 80 cents and a happiness policy. I'm sure that the man would be happier deciding how to spend the 20 cents himself as compared to how the government would choose how to define happiness for him. So instead of aiming for happiness per se, the government should aim for equalizing opportunities for citizens to be happy. This avoids the problem of freeloading. If someone knows that the government is going to make them happy, then why work? Right? Whereas if you focus on providing equal opportunities, then you have to do your part too. In this way, the national target is more concrete. We are aiming for a level of sufficiency such that every citizen has what he or she needs in order to achieve what he wants in life. I do not really support an open-ended goal that will drain the country of its resources eventually. Lastly, this may sound counterintuitive, but sadness is necessary in order for us to understand what is happiness. Consider a guy who has clean drinking water every day. If you give him an additional cup of water, he won't feel much happier. But if a person is deprived of drinking water for 3 days and you give him a cup of water, I'm sure he's happier. So, to aim wholly for happiness is a fantasy. There can be no happiness without hardship. So why aim for happiness? Instead, I think we should aim collectively for desirable goods that can help us find happiness in our own right. That's why I think GDP is a better way or a better national target as compared to happiness alone.
Thank you so much, Professor Leong. So let people decide on their own definitions of happiness rather than having a government civil servant explaining what happiness is to you. Ms. Govind, in your 1 minute, what are the problems with that approach?
I think I would turn to science. You know, there is a science of happiness now. It's called positive psychology. And the way that you have defined happiness, I don't think they would agree with it. There are specific things that lead to happiness, you know, things like gratitude, looking after your health. So just smoking and calling yourself happy, I don't think that would actually come under the definition of happiness that we propose. So that's quite important. Secondly, there's lots of studies to show that the goods and services are not making us happy. We are exposed to so much hyper-commercialism. It's just making us very materialistic and just wanting more and more. But the level of happiness is not going up.
Thank you, Ms. Govind. That seems to echo what Eleanor said about the Eastland paradox, that getting more money is not necessarily making people happier. So should the government get involved in trying to make people happier, forcing resource allocations to solve unhappiness? What do you think in your 1 minute?
I think that you've raised several interesting points, but I think there are gaps in what you've just said. For example, I mean, the literature in happiness is still very, very young. Therefore, there's still a lot of unexplored areas. What you've mentioned are just few of the studies that have been done, but as we all know in the history of science, as time goes on, things change. So that's the first point. The second thing is that you are asking a government to actually decide what's best for its people. Yes, a government may be able to do a good job with quantitative measures if it's a good and benevolent government. But what if you have Adolf Hitler, for example? You know, he used to say, you know, let's kill all the Jews. You know, it makes the German people happier, right? So, you know, when you have vague and subjective concepts, it is very, very difficult to say that, hey, you know, definitely it will serve the good interests of the people, because there are other factors involved, like the quality of government as well.
Thank you, Professor Leong. It's a fairly extreme example, but what if the government does want to manipulate the data? If every government can define their own happiness index, then maybe they can just pick the indices that they do best in and ignore the rest. Eleanor, what do you think?
Look, I think the negative has sort of totally misunderstood how measures of happiness. Happiness is just a short form used for a bunch of indices that have to do with well-being. They include economic and other so-called objective measures, but they also include whether a country provides sufficient capability, capacity, education, health, etc., for people to do well, whether they're getting their economic well-being at the expense of things like leisure, time with family. So basically, although we use the word happiness, it's not subjective happiness. The measure that we are talking about is something that's much more holistic than that. The negative is, I think, talking about a very simplistic idea of happiness. I think that if the affirmative can show us what goes into this measure and how complex and sophisticated a measure it actually is, and how transparent it is, because if you look at how Bhutan decides this measure, you know, the various parts of it are all open for people to see. Where to draw the lines are also open for people to comment on. It's not some black hole that the government decides on its own.
Can I just throw it over to the negative very quickly? Professor Leong or Professor Agarwal, do you have any comments on that?
So I would agree. Let's say we have a very well-defined measure currently of happiness. But as a country is slipping on that index, what will stop a policymaker or a politician not to include other measures like reducing taxes on cigarettes or legalizing drugs to make people happy? We know those things make people happy. So even if we come up with well-defined measure, in the future, the government can easily manipulate these things.
And if you use GDP, what's to stop a government from sort of shifting production from free household services, which benefit anyone, shifting people out into the workforce and sort of and bumping up artificially numbers as well. So the game that we play, the number that we put up there, decides how people play the game. Right, and there will always be possibility for abuse. But the question is the number, at least in goal or in aspiration, a more holistic, a more representative one of what would make for a good life for everyone in the country?
And then I'm going to throw very quickly to Chelva. Yeah. You look like you've got a great thought brewing. You shared with us.
Thought. I mean,
it's always great if it comes from you, Chelva.
Thank you, Eleanor.
There we go. It's my last chance to compliment you.
How you measure it is a different problem. The point is, if you're happy, you should know it. All this business about, the government might mislead you and tell you are happy when actually you're not happy. I mean, if we don't know when we are happy ourselves, then I think we're really sad.
But what if we're not predisposed to happiness? What if we're just generally unhappy as a population or biologically?
You mean we are in a state of national depression?
So there are some statistics about that, and people have looked into whether you've got a set point of happiness. But the studies suggest that if objective factors change, that set point also changes.
Understood. Eleanor, let's throw it over very quickly to Professor Agarwal. You look like you're dying to respond.
So I want to take Eleanor a little bit on that issue of Bhutan, because I'm not sure it's very transparent. In my understanding of Bhutan they have some objective outward measures that you can look at. But one way they're also trying to achieve happiness is by these divisive policies that are against the minorities. So what this allows is the happiness of the majority to go up, but the misery of the minorities also goes up. So what happens? The average happiness of the country goes up. So they say country is happy, but there are minorities who are unhappy. This is not being measured as objectively.
I would dispute you on that.
I'm going to have to throw it very quickly, actually, to the affirmative side. Give you guys a chance to chip in. They've criticized the Bhutan model. What do you guys think?
You see, the criticisms you're throwing Bhutan and comparing it to Adolf Hitler killing the Jews. This is assuming totalitarian states. Even Bhutan is a monarchy, right? So just because we are focused on happiness as a measure does not mean we have to throw out democracy and transparency and all those other aspects of good governance. We still need those parts of the puzzle. And if we have that, and measures are transparent, the citizens will be able to know if the governments are manipulating data. And for that matter, governments manipulate GDP data all the time. You can think about Vietnam and China.
Thank you so much. Well, we've got an exciting debate brewing, and we've got another break right now. When we come back, more questions from the audience and our viewers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates. I'm Gaurav Kirti. We've got a great panel debating happiness and whether it should be a country's national target. You've heard their arguments, and I'm sure you've got plenty of questions for them. So viewers at home, please send us your questions via the website. Let's start with a question from the audience. I believe you have a question over there in the rear.
I do. My question is the resistance to Bhutan's gross national happiness concept due to the size of the country, or is it because it has not arrived at the GDP level of other small countries, such as where we are right now?
I assume that's a question for the negative, so either of you care to respond?
As I mentioned earlier, I think I have an inherent problem the way they're measuring happiness. As far as I understood the index, it's very subjective. And what they do is the index is measured by kind of suppressing minority votes there. And as a result, the average index will go up because their minorities who are small in number, they feel suppressed, they're unhappy, but the majority is happy because they feel happy. Just think about Rwanda and other countries where there are civil wars. The majority is always happy out of those outcomes. The minority is unhappy. The average happiness goes up of that country. So I have no argument against GDP or any of those measures. I think Denmark is happy and has good GDP. But those are uncorrelated. There's no positive correlation I'm trying to identify from there. I'm just saying the way Bhutan is doing it, I think, is wrong.
Would the affirmative side have any comments on how Bhutan is doing it or how a measurement for happiness could be improved?
I don't see why we need to keep talking about Bhutan. I mean, we can learn from other examples. We can create something better. We first need to value it. There's already a big global discussion taking place on measurement, and the UN has passed a resolution on happiness and invited all member states to measure the happiness and well-being of its countries and use that to guide public policy. So things are moving. I think we should move instead of only looking at one thing that may not be perfect.
So it's a question of principle. Do we adopt happiness first as, in principle, the target, and then in practice we'll work out a better system? That's what you're saying. Well, we have a question here from one of our viewers at home, and it's along these lines. Let's have it up. How will a government know how to make me happy? And I guess I'm going to throw this again to the negative side as well. Professor Leong, how does a government know what makes people happy and how do they make policy out of that?
I guess that's my main point. Just now I was explaining that at the end of the day, if you want to institute happiness as a national policy, you must do something concrete. I think having the idea of happiness as a national target is very fluffy. Why? Because it's very hard to operationalize. If you are saying that, hey, I'm going to institute a happiness policy, I have to decide what goods and services, something tangible, what am I going to provide for the people, right? So what government is able to read each individual's mind and say that, well, if I take money from you to actually fund this happiness policy, I know what you want better than yourself. That's my point, in the sense that if you give an individual the money, let him have the right to decide how to spend his money, he'll be a lot happier. He'll be a lot happier as compared to if you just throw him a happiness policy and say, there you go. Here's happiness policy. Now be happy.
So let him make his own decisions and his own trade-offs. And actually, United States and France was surveyed as part of the United Nations Happiness Index, and they were asked to list the top 3 activities that make them happy: making love, walking, and exercise. How does a government institute that in the policy?
I think, we have to understand that different people and countries will have different ideas of happiness at different points of their development. And in today's world, we have the tools and technologies in order for governments to really understand where their populations are. And I think what's needed is for governments to develop calibrated tools to actually improve overall happiness. And as has been said, this will include objective measures as well, everything from health, education, social connections and relationships. It will include things as well as the amount of leisure time, which is something that is undervalued right now in our GDP-focused world.
Thank you so much. Could we have another question from the audience? Perhaps the lady over there.
Hi, I have a question for our 2 economists. Assuming a wise governance, would you prefer to live in a country that measures GDP or measures happiness? And in terms of, if you were to take down the hat of an economist and it's just you as a person, which would be your choice?
I can take, then you can. Okay. Again, I think this goes back to the argument is, if there is $50,000 that I have, why should I give it to the government then to decide how to spend it on me to make me happy? When I have it, let me spend it myself to determine what makes me happy. Why should I give it away to somebody? And how will they know what will make me happy? Even if they have the best intentions, it's still they will have to come sit down, waste a lot of resources to get into my head to decide what makes me happy. Maybe today a BMW makes me happy, but tomorrow eating a burger makes me happy. Then how will they optimize every day? How will they operationalize this thing?
It's an interesting point, and there's the old joke, if the happiest person in your country is an unemployed fisherman, should the government force everybody to become unemployed fishermen so that they become equally happy? Professor Leong?
I think I want to add on to what my debating partner just said. At the end of the day, we have limited time, limited resources. So we can either choose to focus on one thing or focus on two things. If we focus on many, many things, our attention becomes very dispersed and therefore we become less productive in each area. So our argument is that, yes, number one, there are a lot of difficulties with operationalizing happiness. So since that's not clear, let's not waste resources doing that first. Let's do what we have done well all this while, that is maximize GDP growth. Then with GDP growth, everyone can decide how they want to spend the money. So that is our main argument.
Ms. Govin, do you think that the government should get involved in happiness?
Yeah, I really feel that we need to be looking at the science. There's now a science of happiness, and they research what helps people feel true happiness. Things like gratitude, optimism, forgiveness, learning how to cope with hardship well. These are well-researched pathways to happiness, and people may not know. Most people may not read self-help books. So we need the education system to support them and help them, and use a science like positive psychology.
Thank you so much. Well, we have time for one more question from the audience. We have the gentleman in front.
Okay, I think, again, coming back to practical Singapore here, how do we devise or calculate a happiness index in this context here? I think we don't need to, because bottom line here is all the numbers are out there. Happiness will firstly come from growth, money. At the end of the day, beyond money now, we've got the money on the table, we've got a roof over our head. Are we happy? Happiness is a state of mind. Now, how do we then progress beyond that? We've got a lot of unhappy people out there. The train's crowded. We've got to do something about it. Now, what's next?
Sorry, I'm going to have to actually stop you right there. But we have
how are policy going to be used to cope with unhappy people?
So how do you operationalize the policy, which is the question they're asking? And actually, we have a question from the internet that banks on the same area, which I'm going to pass the affirmative. Will happiness cost too much for a country to pursue? Who will pay to make people happy? Mr. Varaketh, who's going to pay to make other people happy in the country?
I think happiness should be seen as sort of a thermometer reading that lets a government know whether it's moving in the right direction or not. And based on whether happiness moves up or down, governments can then identify which parts of the country or policies are not going well, whether it's healthcare or economic growth, so on and so forth. And so, it essentially helps governments identify the areas rather than assuming that GDP growth alone is going to deliver success for everybody.
Thank you so much. Any quick responses from this side, Professor Leong or Professor Agarwal?
Do you want to?
Just a quick one.
Just, if you put it that way, for example, if everyone in the country wants prolonged unemployment benefits, if 26 weeks is not enough, should we give them 50 weeks instead? That way, after they enjoy the unemployment benefits, they become redundant in society because their skill sets have become obsolete. Does it really help them? They may be happy while enjoying the unemployment benefits, but what about the long-term consequences? No one actually talked about it.
So people might not think about their own long-term consequences of the actions that make them happy today, might not make them happy in the future. Well, we've got some really good questions, and it's time for another quick break. When we come back, we'll hear the closing arguments and then the final vote. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates. We've been debating the question of whether happiness should be the national target. All speakers have made plenty of good arguments from both sides, but have you chosen your side yet? It's time now for each speaker to wrap up their case in just 60 seconds. We'll start with Mr. Varaketh. You have 1 minute to conclude and persuade the audience to vote to your side.
I think we should remember that we are dealing here with two imperfect measures. GDP is an imperfect measure of progress. Happiness at the moment is also an imperfect measure. But we should not put the cart before the horse. Once we establish happiness as a national target, measurements for that will improve over time and we will get there. But do not expect many politicians and economists around the world to be open and frank about this. Many of them still believe in the mantra of economic growth. Nobody likes to admit that we've been wrong for decades. People by nature do not like change. It will take time, money and resources to measure happiness, but we must do it. One last example. When the last tuna is fished from the oceans and it is sliced up and served in some restaurant far away, GDP and economic growth will go up, but the world's happiness will go down big time. Now, which measure would you rather have?
Thank you so much, Mr. Vadaketh. Well, the last person eating that last tuna might be happy, but the other 7 billion of us will be miserable. Professor Agarwal, in your 1 minute, tell us why we should retain current measures for economic development.
So let me start from the onset. I am not against happiness. What I am against is the institutionalization of happiness. As I've argued earlier, happiness is a subjective measure and easy to manipulate. We have many examples of countries how they're manipulated. On the other hand, economic indicators are harder, not impossible to manipulate, but harder. The opposite team would like to say they're equally likely to be manipulated. That's not true. They're harder to manipulate. So irrespective of winning this debate or losing this debate, I am truly happy being here. Let me make one more point. Try to just illustrate. Let me take you way back to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had this policy of bread and circus. What that means was they were giving free bread to their citizens and costly circus games to keep them entertained and happy. Okay? Why were they doing that? Because effectively the empire was crumbling, and that's the only way they were diverting their minds. The current policymakers...
Thank you so much, Professor Agarwal. But it's an interesting argument about the Roman Empire. Is it still true today, Ms. Govind? Is happiness going to come at a big cost to us?
Okay.
You have 1 minute.
It is, of course, not only the responsibility of governments to look at happiness and well-being, it's all of us. And we should prioritize it because time is running out. Time is running out for the planet, as scientists have warned us. We can't just have endless production and consumption of goods, which is destroying our planet. And time is running out for each of us. Sometimes we forget that we have limited time. We can die at any time. And when you die, you're going to ask yourself, was I happy? So instead of waiting to do that on our deathbed, I'm saying let's do it now, and let's look at the right places for the right answers.
Thank you so much, Ms. Govind. Professor Leong, should the government be the one who tells us on our deathbed whether we were happy or not? You have 1 minute to have the last word in this debate. Your time starts now.
At the end of the day, I think GDP is an established measure, okay, but happiness is not. So if we were to try to combine GDP with happiness, who is going to pay for these trials? Because there will be a lot of costly mistakes made along the way. That's the first point. The second thing is that I'm not against happiness. I'm just against instituting it as a national policy. Because at the end of the day, if you try to extrapolate it to a state level, we see that there are many operational problems that arises. Last but not least, if you value happiness, what about the other emotions as well, like inspiration and things like that? Are we also going to try to institute those as a national policy? And who's going to pay for all those other things as well?
Thank you so much, Professor Leong. So it's subjective, and there's going to be a lot of challenges putting it into practice. Adrian, what are your thoughts? Has it convinced you yet?
Look, the motion is that happiness should be the national goal, which means happiness is important, that's a given, but it also means that national resources should be devoted to it. That means the government is going to be involved in telling me what makes me happy. That really is the last resort of any incompetent government. That really is a license for any government to make up stuff about gratitude, optimism, forgiveness. Listen, folks, the government is telling you, you have more inspiration, you should be happier. Look, I don't know what makes me happy. You ask 10 individuals, you get 10 different answers. Today, what makes me happy today may not make me happy tomorrow. I don't want a ministry of happiness. I don't want the government to decide on what makes me happy. They can just do their job. Contrary to what Singaporeans believe, government is not God.
So the government should not involve itself in decisions like that.
Adrian, I don't usually disagree with you, but you've got it wrong. This debate is not about whether governments should make us happy. This debate is about how we measure whether we as a nation progress. Should we measure that merely by our store of production, or should we measure that in a more multifaceted way? Look at the Bhutanese National Happiness Index. It measures 9 domains. Living standards, that part of it is about whether we have goods and services and everything else. But it also asks us to measure whether we are progressing by our education standards, our health standards, our ecological diversity and resilience, whether we have good governments, whether we have good time use, cultural diversity and resilience, community vitality, psychological well-being. Why should we not measure our success by a more holistic, multifaceted index than by a single part of it, namely the material part of it. And it's not about whether the governments do that to us, it's about whether we measure ourselves that way.
Adrian, you look like you disagree with this point of view.
Well, I'm extremely dubious because it's already hard enough to get the government to do one thing properly. I'm not going to give them a license to go into my psychological well-being and waste resources and set up another administrative bureaucracy.
Look, the government doesn't give you the GDP either. I mean, it is not about government making us happy. It's about how you measure yourself. Are you good? Well, maybe you would. Are you going to measure yourself as being well-off just because you have the BMW? I believe it's a nice one.
Shelva, do you want to jump in very quickly to this fight that's going on about happiness? This is the most angry, happy debate I've ever had.
Actually, it's a Maserati. But
and you are happy.
No. I think that from what I understand of the opposition's arguments, they say that they're not against happiness, but it's so difficult to measure, and how is the government going to do anything about making each specific A, B, and C person happy, that they should concentrate on things that they know how to do, like improving the GDP, and thereby putting more money in the individual's pocket and let him make himself happy. But if that's the argument, then surely they must be conceding that happiness must be the national target, but the best way of achieving it is to let each man find his own way or path towards the pot of happiness.
Sounds like you're voting for both sides.
No. So I'm afraid the proposition gets my vote.
And indeed mine.
Well, if each man finds his own way, the government won't know what to do. Basically, we are just asking our government to give us all happy endings, and I'm not in favor of that.
All right, well, I'm going to throw this very unusually to the negative side to defend some of the accusations that have been made so far. What do you think?
It's not an accusation, it's an observation.
It's an observation.
Yeah.
The analysis of your arguments. Do you think governments have an ability to make good policy based on happiness? Or where are the flaws? Where are the shortcomings? Where will the gaps be?
Let me put it another way, right? If the information shows us that people are not happy because their health is declining, right? But that doesn't turn up in the GDP. What is government's job? Is government's job to pursue GDP and ignore the information about people's health? Or is government's job to find some way to balance both? And that's all the making of happiness a national target asks for. That government balances and takes into account information about happiness that may not find its way into
So should
GDP.
the government ban alcohol, smoking, fast food, junk food to make us healthier?
Actually, it just turned out to be the opposite. If the government wants to make people happier, they will actually have to remove all bans on all substance abuse products. Because that's what we know from science, that those things make people happier. There is enough medical evidence taking drugs simply makes people happy. So should we then start just removing all
That would lead us down a very different path of economic development,
exactly.
I assure you all.
So I worry that it's a slippery slope argument. Once we start going down on that slope, there is no stopping. Because tomorrow, a new politician comes in and he says, we are not high on that index. Okay, let's reduce the taxes on this product or this product, and everybody will be happy.
But why are we all seeing it, or why are you seeing it as as the government's job? Surely if it's a national target, it's each one of us.
Very quickly, I'm going to ask them to respond
job.
so that it's fair to both sides. Any thoughts? How can government make policy on happiness?
I think using this example of drugs is again not a good one because obviously there would have to be some of the same limits that we've had all along. And it doesn't mean that somebody is happy for 24 hours. That boosts his happiness for the next 6 months because drugs can lead to quite terrible addictions. So I don't buy that argument. And I think it is very possible for governments, once they have happiness reading, to do exactly as the judges have said, to use that to balance policy requirements across the different facets of life, rather than just focusing on economic growth.
All right, well, we've got a great debate so far. We've got many perspectives, and you've all made your case. But before we get to the final vote, let's give the audience a little bit of time to sit back, reflect. Viewers at home, please log into the internet website and cast your final votes. It's time to choose a side. And now it's time for our final tally. Let's have the results up on our screens. Well, it didn't move too much from the original position. It looks like 70.9% of the people believe that, yes, happiness should still be the national target. After hearing all our speakers and having a great debate, that wraps up this season of Bridging Asia. Congratulations to the Team Affirmative. Thank you all to the speakers, our audience members here and at home, and to our judges. And it's been a fantastic time. Wraps up this season of Bridging Asia. On that happy note, thank you all and good night.